On a Tuesday morning in late October of 2019, Nora Lindgren stood in the driveway of a farmhouse outside Fillmore County, Minnesota, and looked at a folding table covered in cardboard boxes. The estate sale had been running since 7. It was not quite 9. Most of what remained was the kind of thing you'd expect: cracked mixing bowls, a box of Reader's Digest condensed books, a set of curtain rods still in the packaging from 1987. But Nora wasn't looking at any of that. She was looking at a wooden cabinet, roughly the size of a bread box, sitting at the far end of the table with a piece of masking tape on the lid that said $75. She had driven 3 hours to get here. Let me tell you about Nora Lindgren, because you need to understand her before you can understand what she did with what she found, and why it mattered, and why the people who laughed at her in the spring of 2020 stopped laughing by the fall of 2022 and started showing up at her door instead. Nora was 24 years old in October of 2019. She had grown up on her family's farm in York County, Nebraska, where her father, Darren Lindgren, raised corn and soybeans on 600 acres of ground his own father had broken in the 1960s. Darren was a good farmer, methodical, consistent. He planted the same varieties he'd planted for 15 years, bought his seed from the same dealer in the same town, rotated his fields on the same 2-year schedule, and produced yields that were slightly above the county average every single year, without exception. He was proud of that consistency. He thought it was the point. Nora had grown up watching him and admiring him, and somewhere around her junior year of high school, quietly realizing that she wanted to understand farming at a level her father didn't have the vocabulary for. Not because he was wrong, because she was curious about what was underneath the decisions he made on instinct and habit, and she wanted to know if instinct and habit were the best tools available or just the most familiar ones. She went to the University of Minnesota on a partial scholarship and studied plant genetics under a professor named Dr. Erica Sorensen, who had spent 20 years cataloging open-pollinated corn and vegetable varieties that had been quietly disappearing from American agriculture since the consolidation of the seed industry in the 1980s and 1990s. Dr. Sorensen had a particular way of explaining what was at stake that Nora never forgot. She said it like this: every time a seed variety disappears, a conversation ends. And once it ends, you can't restart it, because the other party's gone. What she meant was that every open-pollinated variety that had been developed over decades or centuries by farmers working specific soil in specific climates carried genetic information that had been tested by reality in ways no laboratory could replicate: disease resistance, drought tolerance, specific flavor compounds, specific root architecture adapted to specific ground. That information lived in the seed. When the seed was gone, the information was gone with it. Nora wrote her senior thesis on the genetic diversity loss in commercial corn breeding between 1970 and 2010. Dr. Sorensen told her it was the best undergraduate thesis she had supervised in 15 years. Nora graduated in the spring of 2019, came home to York County, and started helping her father on the farm while she figured out what came next. What came next, it turned out, was an estate sale in Fillmore County, Minnesota, posted on a regional agricultural history Facebook group by a woman named Harriet Johansson, who was liquidating the property of her recently deceased aunt. The aunt's name was Mildred Hassel. She had farmed 60 acres in Fillmore County for 53 years, mostly vegetables and dry beans, and a small plot of sweet corn she'd maintained for her own use, and for the Harmony Farmers Market, where she'd sold produce every Saturday from May through October for 4 decades. Harriet's post was brief. It listed furniture, kitchen equipment, hand tools, and one wooden seed cabinet with approximately 200 labeled envelopes. Harriet said she didn't know what was in the envelopes and didn't have any use for them and was pricing the whole cabinet at $75 to move it. Nora saw the post at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night and drove to Fillmore County before dawn. Let me tell you about what Nora found when she opened that cabinet, because the contents are the reason this story exists, and the reason it's still being told, and the reason a young woman from York County, Nebraska, ended up standing in front of 300 farmers and extension agents at a regional agricultural conference in Des Moines in the fall of 2023, with a slide on the screen behind her that showed a dry bean variety nobody in that room had seen in 40 years. The cabinet was made of oak, hand-built, with 48 small drawers arranged in a 6x8 grid. Each drawer had a small brass pull and a paper label in neat handwriting. Nora opened the first drawer and found 7 small paper envelopes, each one sealed with a strip of masking tape and labeled in the same careful hand. The labels included a variety name, a year, a location, and in some cases a short note. The first envelope she picked up said, "Speckled cranberry bean, 1987, Mildred's garden, good germination, saved from best pods." The second said, "German pink tomato, 1993, from Vera Gustafson's farm, Lanesboro, original seed from her grandmother's garden." The third said, "Mortgage lifter tomato, 1991, selected for early set and short seasons." Nora stood at that folding table for 40 minutes, opening drawers and reading labels. She did not buy anything else at the estate sale. She paid the $75, carried the cabinet to her truck with both hands, set it on the passenger seat, and drove home to Nebraska. What she had, she was fairly certain, was a seed collection spanning more than 50 years of careful selection by a woman who had understood, intuitively and without any formal training in plant genetics, exactly what Dr. Sorensen had spent a career trying to explain to graduate students. Mildred Hassel had been saving and selecting and labeling seeds since at least the 1960s. The earliest envelope in the cabinet was dated 1967. It contained a variety of dry bean labeled simply Hassel Speckled, 1967, first year saved. Nora counted the envelopes when she got home. There were 211 of them, 43 distinct vegetable and grain varieties. Some represented in a single envelope. Some represented across 15 or 20 envelopes spanning 3 decades of annual selection. Let me tell you about the science, because this is where the story gets serious, and where the people who later laughed at Nora should have stopped to listen instead. Open-pollinated seed varieties, meaning varieties that breed true from saved seed, as opposed to commercial hybrids that must be repurchased each year, carry genetic diversity within the variety itself. A population of open-pollinated beans or tomatoes or corn is not genetically identical. Individual plants within the population vary slightly, and over years of farmer selection, choosing the best plants, saving their seeds, planting those seeds the following year, the population adapts to the specific conditions of the specific farm where it's grown. Soil pH, rainfall pattern, frost dates, pest pressure. The variety becomes, over decades, a living record of those conditions. Dr. Sorensen's research, along with studies published by the Organic Seed Alliance and the Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa, had documented that open-pollinated varieties developed through long-term farmer selection showed measurably superior performance in their home environments compared to commercial varieties developed for broad regional adaptation. The trade-off was that they didn't travel as well. A bean variety selected for Fillmore County, Minnesota, might not outperform a commercial variety in York County, Nebraska. But it carried genetic traits, specific traits, documented traits that could be crossed into adapted varieties to introduce disease resistance or drought tolerance or flavor compounds that commercial breeding had abandoned in favor of yield uniformity and shelf life. What Nora had in that cabinet was not just a collection of old seeds. It was a genetic library, and the envelopes were the catalog. She spent the winter of 2019 into 2020 germination testing every envelope in the cabinet. She set up a grow lot in her father's barn and planted small samples from each envelope in seedling trays, recording germination rates, growth characteristics, and any visible abnormalities. Of the 211 envelopes, she got viable germination from 188. 23 envelopes were too old or had been stored in conditions that killed the seed. The remaining 188 represented 37 distinct varieties in viable condition. She photographed every seedling. She took notes in a spiral-bound notebook that she carried in the front pocket of her Carhartt jacket. She wrote to Dr. Sorensen and described what she had found. Dr. Sorensen wrote back within 2 hours and said, and Nora kept the email. She said, "Nora, if what you're describing is accurate, that collection may include varieties that are not represented in any public seed bank. Please be careful with those seeds. They are irreplaceable." Nora was already being careful. She had been careful since the moment she set the cabinet on her passenger seat. Her father, Darren, watched all of this with a kind of patient skepticism that was not unfriendly, but was not encouraging either. He was a practical man. He grew corn and soybeans on 600 acres, because corn and soybeans were what the market wanted, and what his equipment was set up to handle, and what he knew how to grow at a level that paid the bills. He did not have a strong opinion about open-pollinated bean varieties from Fillmore County, Minnesota, one way or another. He thought Nora was smart. He thought she might be spending a lot of energy on something that didn't have a clear path to a paycheck. In February of 2020, Nora sat down with him at the kitchen table after dinner and laid out what she wanted to do. She had identified 3 varieties in the Hassel collection that she believed had commercial potential in the specialty and direct market vegetable sector. The speckled cranberry bean, a dry bean with exceptional flavor and a distinctive appearance that was commanding premium prices at farmers' markets and through restaurant supply channels. The German pink tomato, a large beefsteak type with flavor characteristics that blind taste tests at the University of Minnesota had rated significantly above commercial varieties. And a sweet corn variety labeled Hassel's Early Yellow, which Mildred's notes indicated had been selected for maturity in 62 days, making it viable in short-season climates where commercial sweet corn varieties often failed to set properly before frost. She wanted to grow trial plots of all 3 on the family farm, not 600 acres, not even close. She was asking for 2 acres of garden ground near the barn, access to water, and her father's patience for one growing season. Darren set down his fork. The kitchen went quiet. Her mother, Carol, stopped clearing plates. Her younger brother, who was 16 and eating the last of the bread, stopped chewing. Darren looked at the notebook. He looked at the germination records. He looked at the photographs Nora had printed and arranged in a folder. He said he needed to think about it. He said he wasn't sure what the point was of growing vegetables on a grain farm. He said the market for specialty dry beans was thin, and she shouldn't count on restaurant buyers who might not be there next year. Carol waited until Darren had gone to check on something in the shop, and then she sat down across from Nora and said quietly, she said, "He'll come around. Give him a week. He just needs to feel like it was his idea." It took 4 days. Darren came in from the field on a Thursday afternoon and told Nora she could have the 2 acres by the barn, and he'd run a water line to it before planting. He said it like he was doing her a favor. Nora said thank you and did not say anything else. Let me tell you about the spring of 2020, because that is when the laughing started, and the laughing is important to this story in ways that go beyond embarrassment. The Lindgren farm was not an island. It existed inside a community of farmers and suppliers and dealers and neighbors who knew each other's business the way people in small places always do. Not through gossip exactly, but through the ordinary accumulation of observation over years. Darren bought his inputs from a co-op in York called Consolidated Ag Supply, where the manager was a man named Dale Crowley. Dale had been running that co-op for 22 years. He was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from being the person everyone in a county depends on for something they can't easily get elsewhere. He knew every farmer in a 30-mile radius by name and by acreage, and by what they planted and what they owed. He held court at the counter of Consolidated Ag every morning between 7 and 9, and farmers came in for coffee and seed catalogs and stayed for the conversation, which Dale mostly led. In April of 2020, word got around, the way word gets around in small places, that Darren Lindgren's daughter was planting a garden with old seeds she'd bought at an estate sale in Minnesota. Dale Crowley heard about it. He did not hear about it from Nora. He heard about it from someone who had heard about it from someone else, which meant by the time it reached him it had already passed through the filter of other people's skepticism and come out the other side sounding faintly ridiculous. Nora was in Consolidated Ag on a Tuesday morning in late April, picking up a bag of inoculant for the beans when Dale brought it up. He was behind the counter with 2 other farmers leaning on it, men Nora had known since childhood, men who had watched her grow up and who she suspected thought of her as Darren's girl who went off to college and came back with ideas. Dale said, without particular malice, but without any particular gentleness either, he said, "Heard you're planting a garden with seeds from a dead woman's attic." The 2 men at the counter looked at Nora. Nora said yes. She said she'd found an exceptional collection of open-pollinated varieties with documented selection histories going back to the 1960s, and she was running trial plots to evaluate their performance and market potential. Dale smiled. It was not an unfriendly smile. It was a smile of a man who has heard many ideas over 22 years and has watched most of them not work out. He said, open-pollinated. He said that like it was a phrase from a language he'd decided not to learn. He said farmers in this county had moved past open-pollinated varieties for a reason. He said modern hybrid seed was engineered for yield and disease resistance and consistency, and that if old-time varieties were better, the market would have kept them. He said he'd hate to see her spend a summer on something that wasn't going to pencil out. One of the men at the counter laughed. Not a cruel laugh, just the laugh of someone who thought the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone laughed at an idea before they understood it? Not because they were stupid, but because the idea sat outside the frame of everything they'd built their certainty on, and the laugh was easier than the effort of moving the frame. That's what happened at the counter of Consolidated Ag Supply in York, Nebraska, in April of 2020. Dale Crowley was not a stupid man. He was a man whose entire professional identity was built on the premise that modern commercial seed was the correct answer to the question of what farmers should plant. An open-pollinated bean variety from a dead woman's cabinet in Minnesota was not just an alternative idea. It was a question about whether his answer had always been right. The laugh was faster than the question. Nora paid for her inoculant. She said evenly, she said, "I'm not trying to replace hybrid corn, Dale. I'm trying to find out what's in these seeds and whether anyone still wants it." She said it without heat. She picked up her bag and walked out. She drove home and planted her 2 acres. Let me tell you about the growing season of 2020, because what happened in those 2 acres by the barn is the first chapter of a proof that took 3 years to complete and ended with Dale Crowley standing in Nora's driveway asking for her help. Nora planted the speckled cranberry beans on the last day of April. She planted the German pink tomatoes as transplants in the second week of May, after frost risk had passed. She planted Hassel's early yellow sweet corn in 2 successions, the first on May 15th and the second on June 1st, to extend the harvest window. She kept records of everything: planting dates, emergence dates, first flower, first fruit, irrigation events, any pest or disease pressure she observed. She took photographs every week. She weighed every harvest. She recorded everything in the spiral notebook, and when the notebook filled up, she started a second one. The speckled cranberry beans performed in a way that surprised even Nora, who had expected them to perform well. They emerged cleanly in 5 days, which was fast for dry beans in Nebraska spring soil. They set pods heavily and evenly. They showed no significant aphid pressure in a year when aphids were bad across the county. When Nora harvested and threshed them in late August, she weighed out 412 pounds of dry beans from less than half an acre of planting. She took a sample to a specialty food broker in Lincoln, who supplied dry beans to restaurants and natural food retailers across the region. The broker, a woman named Frances Webb, held a bean up to the light and said she hadn't seen a speckled cranberry with that color and that pattern in years. She said her restaurant accounts had been asking for something like this. She offered Nora $3.40 a pound for everything she had. Commercial dry beans at the elevator that fall were selling for 22 cents a pound. The German pink tomatoes produced 117 pounds of fruit from 6 plants. Nora sold them at the York Farmers Market at $4 a pound. They were gone every Saturday within 40 minutes of the market opening. 3 restaurant buyers from Lincoln drove to the York market specifically after word got around through Frances Webb's network. One of them told Nora he had been looking for a tomato with that flavor profile for 2 years and had not been able to find it in any commercial catalog. Hassel's early yellow sweet corn matured in 61 days from planting. In a county where the average last spring frost falls on May 5th and the average first fall frost falls on October 3rd, that mattered less in a normal year than it would in a short season year. But Nora noted it. She wrote it down. She sent ears to Dr. Sorensen, who had them evaluated by a food science colleague. The colleague reported sugar content significantly above commercial sweet corn averages and a flavor described as complex and persistent, which is food science language for the kind of corn that makes people stop talking at the dinner table. Nora wrote all of this up in a report she sent to Dr. Sorensen in September of 2020. Dr. Sorensen forwarded it to the Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa, which maintains the largest collection of open-pollinated vegetable varieties in North America. The exchange wrote back and said they were not aware of any of the 3 varieties in their collection and asked if Nora would be willing to contribute seed samples for preservation. She said yes. She packaged seed from the best plants of each variety and mailed it to Decorah. The exchange confirmed receipt and told her the varieties would be accessioned into their permanent collection under Mildred Hassel's name as the original developer. Nora wrote Harriet Johansson a letter telling her what her aunt's seeds had turned out to be. Harriet wrote back and said she was glad they'd gone to someone who knew what they were. She said her aunt had talked about her seeds the way other people talked about their children. She said she'd always assumed it was just Mildred being Mildred. It was not just Mildred being Mildred. Let me tell you about the winter of 2020 into 2021, because that is when Nora stopped being a curiosity and started becoming something else, and when her father started paying attention in a different way than he had before. Darren had watched the 2020 season with the particular attention of a farmer who has learned that the ground doesn't lie. He had watched the beans come up clean. He had watched the tomatoes sell out at the market. He had done the math on 412 pounds at $3.40 and compared it to what that same ground would have returned in corn at the elevator. The corn would have returned somewhere between $200 and $240 per acre. The beans had returned more than $700 per acre on their portion of the ground, and the tomatoes had returned over $400 per pound of seed invested. He did not say any of this to Nora directly. He was not a man who changed his position out loud. But in November of 2020, he told her she could have 5 acres the following season instead of 2. He said it like a practical decision. She accepted it like a practical decision. Neither of them mentioned what the numbers had said. Carol watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway and did not say anything, but Nora saw her smile. In the spring of 2021, Nora expanded to 5 acres and added 2 more varieties from the Hassel collection. A dry bean labeled Hassel's Marbled Purple, which Mildred's notes described as exceptionally early and suitable for short seasons, and a winter squash labeled Hassel's Keeper, which the notes said would store in a cool cellar until February without loss of quality. Nora planted both. She also began the process of formally multiplying seed from the 3 2020 varieties to build up enough stock for larger-scale planting and for sale to other growers. She reached out to 6 other farmers in York County and 3 in adjacent counties about the speckled cranberry bean specifically. She had data now. She had a season of performance records and a buyer who had offered a contract price of $3.20 per pound for the 2021 season, which was slightly below her 2020 spot price, but represented a guaranteed market for a larger volume. She brought the data to those conversations the way Dr. Sorensen had taught her to bring data to any conversation. Clearly, specifically, without overselling it, and with full disclosure of what she didn't know yet. 4 of the 9 farmers she talked to agreed to plant trial plots of the speckled cranberry bean on their own ground. One of them was a man named Silas Huber, who farmed 300 acres of mixed ground south of York and who had been looking for a specialty crop to diversify his operation after 2 consecutive years of low corn prices. Silas was not a man who made decisions quickly. He had listened to Nora's presentation at his kitchen table for an hour and a half, asked 17 specific questions, and then said he'd plant 20 acres if she could supply him with enough seed and guarantee the buyer connection. Nora said she could do both. She spent the winter multiplying seed and maintaining her relationship with Frances Webb, who had expanded her restaurant accounts and was now looking for 2,000 pounds of speckled cranberry beans for the 2021 season. At Consolidated Ag Supply, Dale Crowley had heard about the 2020 results. He had not changed his position. He had modified it slightly, in the way that people modify positions they're not ready to abandon, by saying that one good season didn't prove anything and that the specialty market was volatile and that Nora was getting lucky on timing. He said this at the counter on a February morning in 2021 to a group of farmers that included two of the men who had agreed to plant trial plots. They did not argue with him. They just didn't change their plans. Let me tell you about the summer of 2021, because the second season is where the proof stopped being interesting and started being undeniable. Nora's 5 acres produced results that she documented in a report that eventually ran to 31 pages, including photographs, weight records, revenue calculations, and a side-by-side comparison with county average returns for corn and soybeans. The speckled cranberry beans yielded 481 pounds per acre averaged across 3 separate plots, an improvement over 2020 that she attributed to better inoculation technique and optimized plant spacing. At $3.20 per pound under contract, that represented $1,539 per acre. County average corn returns that year were $280 per acre. The German pink tomatoes, now in their second year of selection on Nebraska ground, yielded more heavily than in 2020 and showed what Nora described in her notes as improved adaptation, earlier fruit set, better heat tolerance through July, and reduced blossom drop compared to the first year, which was consistent with what you'd expect from a population beginning to adapt to its new environment through continued selection. Silas Huber's 20 acres of speckled cranberry beans yielded 462 pounds per acre, slightly below Nora's plots but well above anything he'd seen from commodity crops on that ground. He called Nora in September after harvest and said simply, he said, "I want to do 80 acres next year." She said she'd have the seed. The other 3 farmers who had planted trial plots all reported positive results. One of them, a woman named Edith Dykstra, who farmed 140 acres east of York with her husband, reported that the beans had performed better on her light sandy ground than anything she'd planted there in 10 years. She said the root system was remarkable. She said she'd pulled a plant after harvest just to look at it, and the roots had gone down deeper than she expected, which was consistent with what Dr. Sorensen's research had documented about open-pollinated varieties selected in specific soil conditions. They often developed root architecture suited to the conditions where they'd been selected, and Mildred Hassel's Fillmore County ground had similar sandy loam characteristics to Edith Dykstra's East York ground. At the York Farmers Market, Nora's booth had become a destination. People drove from Lincoln. A food writer from the Omaha World Herald came out in August and wrote a piece about the German pink tomatoes that ran in the food section and mentioned Mildred Hassel by name, and described the seed cabinet and the estate sale and Nora's drive to Fillmore County before dawn. The piece was picked up by 2 regional agricultural publications. Dr. Sorensen sent Nora a copy with a note that said, "This is exactly what I hoped you'd do with what you learned." Dale Crowley read the Omaha World Herald piece. He did not say anything about it at the counter of Consolidated Ag, but one of the farmers who was there when he read it said later that Dale had set the paper down carefully and looked out the window for a moment, and then picked up a seed catalog and started flipping through it without appearing to read anything. Let me tell you about the summer of 2022, because that is the year the proof became a verdict, and the year that Dale Crowley drove out to the Lindgren farm in his truck and stood in the driveway and asked for Nora's help. The summer of 2022 was the worst drought year in York County in over 2 decades. It started dry in April and got drier through May and June. By the first week of July, the National Weather Service had placed most of the county in severe drought, and by the third week of July it had been upgraded to extreme drought across the southern half of the county. The corn crop, which had been planted into dry soil and had struggled to establish all spring, was burning up in the fields. Farmers were making the painful calculation of whether to harvest early for silage or wait and hope for rain that wasn't coming. The county average corn yield that year would end up at 61 bushels per acre, against a 5-year average of 173. At elevator prices, that was a financial disaster for anyone without crop insurance, and even with crop insurance, it meant a year of fighting with adjusters and waiting for indemnity payments and falling behind on operating loans. Nora's speckled cranberry beans were fine. That is not an overstatement. They were not merely surviving, they were fine. The deep-root architecture that Edith Dykstra had noticed the previous fall, the root system that reflected 50 years of selection in Fillmore County's sandy loam, was pulling moisture from below the zone where the corn roots had given up. Nora had not irrigated since the second week of June. She had watched her beans and made the decision, based on the plant's visible condition and what she understood about the variety's drought history from Mildred's notes, that irrigation would not be necessary and might actually be counterproductive by encouraging shallow root development. She was right. The beans set pods in the first week of August. They filled those pods through the hottest stretch of the summer. When Nora harvested in early September, she weighed out 437 pounds per acre, down from 2021, but not dramatically. Down in a year when the corn across the road from her bean field had produced 61 bushels per acre, and left Darren Lindgren sitting at the kitchen table doing math that didn't add up. Silas Huber's 80 acres of speckled cranberry beans yielded 419 pounds per acre. He called Nora on a Thursday morning in September, the week after harvest, and she could hear in his voice something she recognized as the particular emotion of a farmer who has just survived something that destroyed his neighbors. He said, "Nora, I need you to know that those beans just saved this operation." She said she was glad. She said it quietly. Edith Dykstra's beans yielded 451 pounds per acre on the light sandy ground that the drought had hit hardest. She drove to the Lindgren farm the Saturday after harvest and sat at the kitchen table with Nora and Darren and Carol and said she wanted to expand to 120 acres the following year. She also said she thought more farmers in the county needed to know about this, and she asked if Nora would be willing to present her data at the York County Farm Bureau meeting in November. Darren, who was sitting across the table and had been listening with his hands folded and his eyes on the table, looked up when Edith said that. He looked at Nora. He said, and this was the first time he had said anything like it out loud, he said, "She'll be there." He said it like it was settled. Nora looked at him. He looked back at her, and then looked back at Edith and said, "She knows more about this than anyone in the county. Let me tell you about what happened in October of 2022, because the story doesn't end with the harvest numbers, and the harvest numbers are not the most important thing that happened that fall." On a Wednesday afternoon, in the second week of October, Nora was in the barn sorting and packaging seed when she heard a truck in the driveway. She came out and saw Dale Crowley's pickup, the white one with the Consolidated Ag logo on the door, parked next to her father's grain truck. Dale was standing beside it with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the field where the bean stubble was still visible. He was not a man who looked uncertain often. He looked uncertain. Nora walked over. She said hello. He said hello back. There was a pause that lasted longer than it needed to. Dale said, "I heard about your yields this summer." Nora said yes. He said, "I've got 6 farmers who came into the co-op this week asking about those beans. Asking me about those beans." He said it like it was slightly uncomfortable to admit. He said he didn't have anything to tell them because he didn't carry open-pollinated varieties and didn't know the agronomics and didn't know the market channels. He said he thought maybe she could help him understand what he was looking at. Nora looked at him for a moment. She said, "Dale, do you remember what you said at the counter in April of 2020? He said he didn't remember the specific conversation. She said she did. She said, "You said farmers in this county had moved past open-pollinated varieties for a reason. You said if old-time varieties were better, the market would have kept them." She said it without anger. She said it the way you say something that is simply true and that you want the other person to hear clearly. Dale was quiet for a moment. He said, "I was wrong about that." She said, "Yes." And then she said, "Come inside." She said she'd show him the data and explain the market channels and tell him what the farmers who wanted to grow these beans needed to know before they started. She said the agronomics weren't complicated, but they were different from hybrid corn, and he needed to understand the differences before he started advising people. She said she'd put together a grower packet for him to take back to the co-op. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Nora spread out her notebooks and her harvest records and her revenue comparisons and her root depth observations and her notes from Dr. Sorensen's research. Dale asked questions. They were good questions. He was, underneath the certainty, a man who had built a career on understanding what farmers needed, and when he finally accepted that his frame had been too small, he was capable of learning quickly. When he left, he shook her hand at the door and said, "I should have listened to you 2 years ago." She said, "Yes." She said, "But you're listening now, and that's what matters for the farmers who are going to plant next spring. Let me tell you about the November Farm Bureau meeting, because that is where the community story turned a corner, and where Darren Lindgren did something that Nora did not expect." The York County Farm Bureau met on the second Thursday of November at the Extension office in York. Nora had been told to expect 40 or 50 farmers. She had prepared a presentation with her yield data, her revenue comparisons, her root architecture observations, her drought performance numbers from the summer of 2022, and a market analysis showing current and projected demand for specialty dry beans and heirloom vegetables in the regional direct market and restaurant supply sectors. She had also prepared a section on seed saving and variety maintenance, because she knew that any farmer who started growing these varieties needed to understand how to maintain them and why it mattered. 83 farmers showed up. The Extension office ran out of chairs. People stood along the walls. Nora stood at the front of the room with her notebook open on the podium and her laptop connected to the projector, and she talked for 45 minutes and then answered questions for another hour. The questions were serious. They were the questions of people who had just survived a drought year and were rethinking assumptions they had held for a long time. Darren sat in the third row. He had come without telling Nora he was coming. She saw him when she walked in, and he gave her a small nod and she gave him one back, and neither of them said anything about it. When she finished, there was a sustained round of applause that is not typical for a Farm Bureau meeting in York County, Nebraska. Darren stood up. He was not a man who stood up at public meetings. He stood up, and the room got quiet because people knew Darren Lindgren and knew that when he stood up, he had something to say. He said, "This is my daughter." He said she drove 3 hours to an estate sale before dawn because she understood something the rest of us didn't. He said she spent 3 years proving it on our ground with our water and her own labor. He said, "I want every farmer in this room to know that I was skeptical too, and I was wrong, and she was right. And if you're thinking about planting these beans next spring, you should call her before you call anyone else." The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping and the rest of the room followed. Nora did not cry. She looked at her notebook and took a breath and said, "Thank you." She said she'd have a sign-up sheet at the back of the room for anyone who wanted seed information for the 2023 season. 51 farmers signed the sheet. Let me tell you about what happened in the years that followed, because the story doesn't end at the Farm Bureau meeting, and the most important thing about what Nora built is not what she built, but what it made possible. By the spring of 2023, Nora had established a seed company she called Hassel Heritage Seeds, named for Mildred, with a website and a catalog and a formal seed multiplication operation on 20 acres of the Lindgren farm that Darren had turned over to her entirely. She was supplying speckled cranberry bean seed to 47 farms across 6 counties. She had contracted with Francis Webb for 2,800 pounds of dry beans for the 2023 season and had a waiting list of restaurant buyers she couldn't yet supply. She had submitted 2 of the Hassel varieties, the speckled cranberry bean and the German pink tomato, to a regional seed trial conducted by the Organic Seed Alliance, and both had placed in the top 3 of their categories for flavor and overall performance. She had also, quietly and methodically, continued working through the remaining varieties in the Hassel cabinet. She had grown out and evaluated 22 of the 37 viable varieties by the spring of 2023. Of those 22, she had identified 7 with characteristics she considered commercially significant, and had begun the multiplication process for all 7. She had sent updated seed samples to the Seed Savers Exchange every year. She had published 2 articles in small circulation agricultural journals about the collection and about Mildred Hassel's contribution to the preservation of regional genetic diversity. She had been cited in a paper by Dr. Sorensen's graduate student on farmer seed saving as a conservation strategy. In September of 2023, Nora was invited to speak at the Practical Farmers of Iowa annual conference in Des Moines. She drove up on a Thursday, checked into a motel, and stood in front of 300 farmers and extension agents and researchers on Friday morning, and talked for an hour about Mildred Hassel and the seed cabinet and what 50 years of careful selection by one woman in Fillmore County, Minnesota, had preserved and what it had meant for a county in Nebraska that almost lost a crop year to a drought. She showed a slide of the wooden cabinet with the brass pulls. She showed a slide of the first envelope she had opened, the one that said Speckled Cranberry Bean, 1987, Mildred's Garden, good germination, saved from best pods. She showed a slide of Silas Huber's bean field in August of 2022, green and full and standing in a county where the corn was burning up. She said, Mildred Hassel never published a paper. She never spoke at a conference. She never applied for a grant. She saved seeds in a wooden cabinet in her farmhouse in Fillmore County, Minnesota, for 53 years because she understood something that the commercial seed industry spent 40 years trying to make us forget. She said, "A seed variety is not a product. It is a relationship between a plant and a place. And when you end that relationship, you lose something that cannot be rebuilt from scratch. You can only recover it if someone was careful enough to save it." The room was quiet after she said that. Then someone in the back started clapping, and the rest of the room followed, and this time Nora did not look at her notebook. Darren had driven up from York. He was in the 5th row. When the room stood up, he stood up too, and he did not sit down until everyone else did. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has a final turn that matters. In the spring of 2024, Nora's brother, who was now 20 years old and had spent 2 seasons working alongside her on the seed operation, sat down at the kitchen table after dinner with a notebook of his own. He had been reading about hemp fiber production and its soil health benefits and the emerging market for regionally grown natural fiber, and he had an idea about growing hemp on 30 acres of the family ground as a rotation crop that would break pest cycles in the bean fields while producing a marketable fiber product through a processor in Lincoln that had just opened a contract program for regional growers. He laid out his data. He showed his numbers. He talked about the soil science. He had clearly been thinking about this for a long time. Nora listened to all of it. She looked at his notebook. She looked at the numbers. She looked at her brother's face, which had the particular expression of someone who has done the work and believes in what they've found, and is waiting to find out if anyone else will believe it too. She said, yes. She didn't ask him to wait. She didn't say she needed to think about it. She said yes, and then she said, "Let's talk about what you need for seed and what the soil prep looks like." And then she asked him if he'd talked to Dr. Sorensen's department about the soil health data, because there was a graduate student there doing exactly this kind of rotation research, and he should reach out. He had not talked to Dr. Sorensen's department. He wrote down the name. Darren watched this from across the table. He did not say anything. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at his 2 children leaning over a notebook together and did not say anything at all. Nora Lindgren still farms in York County, Nebraska. The seed cabinet with the brass pulls sits on a shelf in the barn office above the germination records from the winter of 2019. The masking tape label that said $75 is still on the lid. She left it there on purpose. The speckled cranberry bean is now grown on more than 400 acres across 6 counties. The German pink tomato sells out at the York Farmers Market every Saturday it's available. Mildred Hassel's name is in the Seed Savers Exchange catalog next to 37 variety accessions, which is more than most plant breeders who spent careers in university programs. Dale Crowley carries a rack of Hassel Heritage seeds at Consolidated Ag Supply. He put it near the front door. She drove to an estate sale before dawn. She paid $75 for a wooden cabinet. They laughed. The drought came. The corn died. The beans lived.